clouds called crepuscular rays. And what I'm going to do here is prove in this video, with a series of proofs, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the sun is close and the sun is small. First, I'm going to show you an experiment I did with the sun rays. That's very solid proof that the sun is, in fact, close and not very big. And then I'm going to refute Wikipedia's account of these crepuscular rays. They say that these rays are due to perspective, and that, in fact, they are, for all intents and purposes, parallel lines from a sun that's almost 1,000,000 miles in diameter. But the fact that we see them splaying out, they say that that's due to perspective. I'm going to show that that's impossible. And then number 3, I'm going to show that it's actually, when you take a look at this picture of the crepuscular rays, that actually perspective is missing from this photo, if in fact the sun were 1,000,000 miles in diameter and 93 million miles away. The heliocentric model is in trouble. So let's get to my experiment. I watched a video from my perspective. His video is called Flat Earth Sunbeams, Part 1. I was outside and I go, man, let me try that. And I just kind of ran in, I grabbed some cardboard, I cut some holes in it, and I wanted to see how the sun reacts coming through. So here I am, raising it high over my head, so I'm about 8 feet away from this, and the light doesn't diverge or spread out. It doesn't splay out like we see the crepuscular rays. And this sun's far away. Just like in the heliocentric model, the sun is far away, right? 93 million miles away from our clouds. But we see the sun rays splaying out from the clouds as though it were a close sun and not a faraway sun. Well, you can see when it is far away, the light beams are parallel and they don't splay out or diverge from the clouds. So then I got a little bit more sophisticated. I went inside and I cut some nicer holes in another cardboard. My budget went up. And here they are, and I put some CGI here. I put some beams in there, and you can see they are dead straight. No splaying out. And then you can also, there's a part here where I have it up overhead and I had the same results, no splaying out. So this is the example of the far away sun, that the rays, this is what we should experience coming through the clouds. The rays from a sun that's almost 1,000,000 miles in diameter and 93 million miles away, when those rays get here, they should be parallel and dead straight. But we don't see them as dead straight. We see them splaying out or diverging from the clouds. Something's not right here. Okay, here I am inside. Notice I got my light close. Look at already you can see the light splaying out. You see that? I drew you can see the circles on the floor and on my piece of cardboard actually. Those are the original size of the holes that when I was outside they lined up perfectly. Here you can see them completely splaying out. And if I put the rays on it like this, the sun rays, and that's not even as splayed out as they got, it's just that the cloud is in view. And I want you to be able to see the cloud, which is my cardboard with the holes cut out of it. That way I could line up the rays. But as you can see, when I moved up a little bit off the floor and put the light even closer, the rays really splayed out. So I just wanted you to see that. Okay, so there you go. There's hard evidence that when the light source is close to the clouds, the light will diverge. The dispersion pattern you can see when I was outside, the dispersion pattern remained the same, meaning the 5 holes that I had, that stayed exactly the same, and that's a faraway light source. But when the light source was close, they splay out. That definitely supports the flat Earth model of a small, close sun. Okay, let's analyze this claim that science makes and Wikipedia makes, that the crepuscular rays are due to perspective, that they're actually very close to parallel lines. For all intents and purposes, they are parallel, coming from a sun that's almost 1,000,000 miles in diameter, but we don't see them parallel coming through the clouds. Those crepuscular rays are angled outward. They splay out. They're diverging from the clouds. And Wikipedia is saying that that's due to perspective. Okay, and Wikipedia also uses railroad tracks like these. And they say, see how these converge at your horizon, or they diverge from the perspective of the sun outward? And they're saying that that's what's going on here. Okay, so we need a quick little review of perspective. Notice in this long hallway, All parallel lines and planes angle to the eye level or the eye position of the observer. Notice that the side walls angle in, those are parallel lines to one another, and the ceiling and the floor are also parallel, but notice how they angle toward each other and they come to your eye level. All right, you have an X, Y, and Z axis. So the railroad tracks would fit your Z axis. That's going away from you, and those lines, yes, they converge. But the sun, and especially when the sun's overhead, would be bombarding us with huge vertical parallel lines, or rays, parallel rays. Yet we don't see any of that ever. So what I'm going to show you here is that this claim that these corpuscular rays is due to perspective is not true. It's impossible, because perspective will not converge or diverge or splay out lines or planes that are parallel to one another, that are perpendicular to the viewer or his z-axis. Okay, so like in this picture of the railroad tracks here, the lines going away from you, that's I did with the green line, that's the railroad track, that's obvious. And right from the get-go, they start to converge. Now those are parallel lines, but yet we never see them as parallel. They're always converging as they go away from you. Now the black poles that I have going down the side of the railroad tracks are also parallel lines to one another. But notice that they stay parallel. They don't lose their parallel orientation. They may get shorter and they get smaller, that's true. They do have a sort of a convergence, but they don't change their parallel orientation, these vertical lines, because they're perpendicular to you. Now, this is why invoking perspective to explain the corpuscular rays doesn't work, because perspective does not splay out these vertical lines, yet whenever the sun is overhead, we should see vertical parallel rays everywhere, and yet we don't see them. So perspective as an explanation for this is invalid. You know, what we see is the rays emanating from this omnidirectional sun. The rays fit the size of the sun, and the angles of the rays off the sun also fit the size of the sun and the shape of the sun. But they shouldn't fit the size of the sun if the sun is in fact almost 1,000,000 miles in diameter and 93 million miles away. The rays should be huge and the sun small. So that's telling us that the sun is in fact close. Okay, and let's go back to what Wikipedia said. Wikipedia says that the rays from the sun are in fact parallel lines, but we don't see them that way because of perspective. Perspective splays them out. Okay, look at this picture. I put these rays in. Okay, so this is what's really going on, Wikipedia says. They say the rays are really parallel, and they would be from a 1,000,000-mile diameter sun. But this is what our eyes do through perspective. It splays it out. Okay, here's another one. They say this is how they really are. They're vertical and they're parallel, but our eyes splay them out like this. Okay, so then why doesn't perspective take these telephone poles and splay them out like this? We don't see that, do we? Why doesn't it take these buildings and splay them out like this? They're vertical and they're parallel. Well, because what we see, the corpuscular rays, is not due to perspective. It's just due to the nature of an omnidirectional light source with the light coming out in all directions. And it's coming from a small sun. It's impossible that this sun is 1,000,000 miles in diameter, as I've already showed you. So then if it's not perspective, these corpuscular rays are not due to perspective, as Wikipedia and science in general claims they are, then what are they? Well, it's very simple. All they are is radially propagated light. Or another way of saying it, light rays emanating out from a common center, like the sun, or any light. And I understand that the light rays coming off the sun looks like perspective. It shares the common trait where with perspective all the lines and planes converge at a point in the distance called your vanishing point. The sun also has that look where looks like the rays all converge at a point in the center of the light. Actually, the light rays are emanating out from a common center, but I can understand how they look alike, but they're not the same. Okay, that's all it is. And so, as we've already proved, that perspective can't explain the corpuscular rays, because where are all the vertical parallel sun rays then? They don't exist. Okay, so next I'm going to show you with streetlights and sunlight and how they look exactly alike. Okay, let's take a look at some light rays. Let's look at how the sun and a street lamp look the same. The one on the left is a street light, and the one on the right is the sun. Okay, notice that the light source and the rays match one another. And with the street light, that light is here on Earth, right? It's right there on your street. And those rays look in proportion to that light. They're also here, right? On your street or wherever you see that light. The sun, they're telling us, is actually far away, but the light rays are close. Like when we see these crepuscular rays coming through the clouds. And did you know that streetlights also have crepuscular rays, just like the sun does? And you know what? They look identical. Let's have a look. Here on the left, that's a streetlight, and those are crepuscular rays coming off of that streetlight. And they look identical. They are in the same proportion as our sun and its rays. And you can't say that that's perspective because they're right there. And as we've seen, perspective can't explain those rays anyway. So those rays are nothing more than radially propagated light. In other words, it's light coming from a common center. That's all. And look at this one. The left one is a street light. The one on the right are the sun rays. They are both in proportion to one another. The light source matches its rays, which indicates that they're both local. Okay, and this street light is here. We know it's here, and we know those crepuscular rays are here. There's no fooling us and telling us it's 93 million miles away or a million miles in diameter. And it looks just like the sun that they're telling us is far away and huge, and whose light rays are here, though, on the Earth. Same here. Same as what we see in the sky. The sun matches the sun rays. But in the heliocentric model, with a sun that's 93 million miles away and almost a million miles in diameter, the rays should be completely out of proportion, like this. You know, we shouldn't maybe even see the sun. Maybe the sun should just be a blob of light on the other side of our lit up atmosphere from these huge rays. I mean, we see the sun like it's in our atmosphere, like it's close, but it can't be, according to the heliocentric model. And next, I want to show you how, in this photo, perspective is actually missing. And what's ironic is the very linear perspective that they tried to invoke to explain this photo is actually missing from this photo for the heliocentric model to be true. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, I mean they invoked perspective to describe or explain these crepuscular rays, the fact that they're splaying out from the clouds, because they had to invoke perspective or something because this picture doesn't work for the heliocentric model. This picture of these crepuscular rays is a problem for their model because the sun is supposed to be a million miles in diameter. But the problem is they've invoked perspective, but perspective doesn't work because, as I've already showed you, it doesn't explain the parallel vertical lines that we should see all over the place. Perspective will not splay those out, right? So these vertical rays should be everywhere, the parallel vertical rays, but we don't see them. The perspective that's missing is like the sun is out there and it's almost a million miles in diameter, right? So its sunbeam, it shoots out a sunbeam, and that sunbeam is 100,000 miles wide, let's say. But what we see from here looks very small, right? But not when it gets here. When it gets here, it's going to be massive, okay? But yet, look at these sun rays coming through the clouds. They're small, they're skinny, they're tiny. They match the local sun that we see in the sky here. So that's what I mean by perspectives missing. And let me give you a couple of real-world examples to help you figure this out. Okay, now imagine you're at a football game, an American football game, and you can see the player, the quarterback, down on the field, and he's as big as a peanut, okay, on the field, even smaller. Okay, and the football is the size of a short grain of rice. And he's got this great arm, and he turns around and he throws that ball up to you in the stands, and he can throw it all the way to you. Now, I got a question for you. When the ball gets to you, is it going to be the size of a grain of rice, or is it going to be the size of a regulation football? Well, it's going to be the size of a regulation football, right? But that's not what we see in this picture with the sun rays. Those sun rays fit the size of the sun. And now let's take a look at this soccer player. All right, for those of you who don't know American football, there, he kicks it, he's far away, and the ball gets to you, it's going to be the size of a soccer ball, right? This is proper perspective. This is the perspective we're not seeing when we look at the sun. The sun that we see in the sky is close. Okay, here's a train leaving a station far away down the tracks. Also analogous to the rays leaving the million-mile diameter sun. Okay, the rays would be massive just like the train is massive compared to that little train station. Right? That's proper perspective. Now look at these shafts of light coming from the sun, the rays. The sun on the right here, each of its rays that you see coming off the sun would be about 100,000 miles wide, just like this. You could fit 10 Earths side by side in that ray. Okay, so when we look at these rays, they're not 100,000 miles wide, and they're diverging out from a small sun that we see in the sky. I mean, that proves right there the sun is close and small. Now, I know somebody's going to seize upon this and say, hey, wait a minute, but we don't see perspective with the sun traveling over the flat Earth. We should see it shrink to a dot and disappear. We don't see that. Well, I was going to save this for another video, and I maybe still will, but let me introduce to you celestial perspective. It's different than regular perspective that we're used to every day. Regular perspective, we see a train on the tracks, and as it goes away from you, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it disappears. But the sun, on the other hand, is different because the sun, when it's quote-unquote next to you, is high overhead and has already experienced a reduction in size. Now, as it goes away from you, it follows the convergence lines down to your horizon, essentially keeping its same distance from you. So the two movements offset each other. The one, the sun moving away from you, and then the visually lowering as it follows the convergence lines down to your eye level horizon. Also, the sun is too big to shrink to a dot anyway, right? It's going to go below the observer's horizon before that happens. Now note this about the convergence lines. Notice that on this wall of lines, the higher up they get, the more steep they get. They orient themselves away from the horizontal and more to the vertical. So the train on the tracks, as that goes away from you, it's right on your eye level. It's actually on your z-axis. Here's a picture of the z-axis, x-axis, and y-axis. It's on your z-axis, so all you can see is the train get smaller and smaller and smaller. You can't see any movement laterally or vertically out of that plane. But the sun is different because the sun, even though it's cruising over the Earth parallel to the ground, it's on a much higher plane. So when it's overhead, it's already had a visual reduction in size. So now when it goes away from you and it follows those convergence lines down, it'll appear to be the same size because the going away and the lowering kind of offset each other. And same as this train. If you put this train high up overhead, that will cause it to already have a visual reduction in size also. So now when it goes away from you, it too will maintain its size. Kind of like if you're flying a kite, right? And you have the kite and it's a mile overhead, well, it'll appear a certain size, right? But let's say it takes a nosedive, but the string stays taut, so it goes all the way to the ground. Now it's a mile further down the road from you, but it's still the same size visually, right? So that's kind of how this works too. So let's recap. In my experiment, I showed that when the sun is close, the rays splay out, but when the sun is far, the rays are straight parallel beams. Yet, this is what they show us, this picture of crepuscular rays, and say that that's a faraway sun. Then I showed you how perspective can't explain what we see because it doesn't splay out things like these poles or these buildings. And then I showed how the sun mimics perspective. It has the same look. The light rays radially propagate outward, or they radiate out from a common center. And that's what we're seeing with the sun. It's not perspective. And then I showed how the streetlights, the crepuscular streetlights, match the sun. The same crepuscular rays from the sun and from the streetlights, and they look identical. Both local light sources and local rays. Then I showed you celestial perspective, and that's different from regular perspective, like the train going down the tracks that's on your same plane as your eyes, and as that goes away, it can only shrink. It gets smaller and smaller. But the sun is high up overhead, so it's vertically already had a visual reduction in size. So as it goes down to your eye level horizon, it'll maintain its same size.
With the astronaut suits is that technically they should explode when they are, entered into a vacuum environment. Now, what NASA claims is that the spacesuits are designed to expand a little bit, when they're out in the vacuum of space. But the fact is that they're made out of I want to say, less than a quarter-inch thick.
3/16 inch.
Yeah, 3/16 inch thick material that's 11 different layers of fabrics. Now, I'm sorry, But let me put it to you in this perspective. Do you think that you could make a vacuum chamber out of 3/16 inch material fabrics? And the answer to that is, of course, no.
Yeah, no
That
way.
you have to have structural and tensile strength in order to allow for a spacesuit that's going to enter the vacuum of space. And really, the only way that this could possibly work is if you have a pressure neutral spacesuit enter the vacuum of space. So what that means is that the interior pressure of the spacesuit would have to be a near perfect vacuum. Then they could go out into the vacuum of space and it would still expand, but then that doesn't work. I mean, your body has to be under 15 pounds of pressure per square inch in order for us to survive, because that's what we're used to. So this idea that NASA was sending up sewn together. And the old ones were one piece, but they were still sewn together. The new ones have interchanging parts, but essentially sewn together or slapped together fabrics, entering a near perfect vacuum without exploding, just completely debunks, it totally demolishes the idea that they've been to this so-called vacuum of space. Now, another big point here is that on the moon, the moon is a very, very good vacuum according to Earth terms, because it has no atmosphere, no barometric pressure, um, and so even hopping out onto the moon, assuming that their spacesuits could work, technically the materials should have melted because they were on the day side of the Earth, which is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So their little booties should have melted if they didn't explode.
Big
Um,
time.
Right, but it's just when you start to study more and more of the so-called moon landing footage and watch, it just looks more and more like a set. Like you can literally tell where the foreground is, and then there's almost like a sharp line where they have a background painting, right? So it just becomes more and more absurd, and they continue faking this stuff. The spacewalks are obviously done in underwater tanks. I just recently watched a video. I was going to do a response, but I just made a comment. It was Secure Team 10 had this video that they caught a UFO from the ISS, and it was obviously it was obviously an air bubble. And so I told them in the comments, no, that's not a UFO. It's an air bubble because they're underwater. But you got to try. You got to
Yeah.
try.
Yeah, one of the other things also that they had Jamie from Mythbusters, demonstrating, having his hand inside of that suit, and he's going, you can't do anything with these things being pressurized because, when you think about how much pressure we're actually down under here, you're right. In order to go out into that near perfect vacuum of space, we would have to be at an atmospheric pressure, or the astronauts would have to be at an atmospheric pressure somewhat close to what that space would be, so that when they went outside, it would kind of inflate their spacesuit and give it some pressure. But the problem with that is that when you get biological material or even water in that much of a vacuum, first of all, water will boil all by itself when it's in that much of a vacuum. And of course, that's been proven, by the NASA documentation. I think you may have even put it in here. But beyond that, the guy that was in there, the astronaut that was subject to that, he said, well, the last thing I felt just before I passed out was the water on my tongue starting to bubble, right?
Yeah.
So this is another reason that NASA doesn't use this gigantic, outrageously expensive vacuum chamber for training, because it's as simple as this. No human being can survive in a vacuum like that. It is simply impossible. And the idea that a 3/16 inch quote unquote pressurized suit is going to save you from that is beyond belief, because it would make that suit so unbelievably rigid. It would be like the most taut balloon ever, and you wouldn't even be able, forget about moving your fingers. You wouldn't be able to move your arms or your body, your torso, anything, because it would be so unbelievably rigid from the incredible pressure that pressure differential between the inside of the suit and the outside near perfect vacuum. Not to mention the fact that the guy's blood would be boiling, right? So and here it is right here. Here they're going to put water inside of a vacuum chamber, and we're not even evacuating it that much. He's not getting anywhere near the level of a vacuum of space, right? And so what happens? Here it goes. It's going to start bubbling, just like the astronaut said before he passed out, that the water on his tongue was starting to bubble. So
Yeah,
it
and
is impossible.
that astronaut was in a vacuum that was 3 orders of magnitude lower than the vacuum of space is supposed to be in the heliocentric model. Now, we're not talking about 3 levels lower. We're talking about 3 orders of magnitude. So if you're familiar with, the term, he was barely even in a vacuum compared to what would happen in space. And so the whole idea of spacewalks and moonwalks is just ridiculous. And yeah, you're right. In order for the astronaut to survive, his suit would have to have a constant 15 pounds of pressure per square inch all over his body. Now, when you put him out into the vacuum, yeah, that thing would explode. His blood and saliva and all his liquids would boil, and then he would explode. I mean, that's what would happen. I mean, it's just amazing to me that physicists and pretty much the entire world believed that or didn't think about this when atmospheric pressure has been known for so long. But I guess it's one of those things where if you tell a big enough lie long enough, and you've got enough money to spread it around the curriculum and across the media, that anything people see on TV, any lie people see on TV is the truth, right? I mean, that's what we've got. That's where we've come to.
Totally, 100%. Yeah, it's funny because I saw somebody did a quote unquote flat Earth debunking video. I think it was this morning I was watching it, and the guy on there was saying that, well, no, the reality is the bigger the lie, the more unlikely it will be to succeed, which of course is completely backwards. It's really the bigger the lie, the more likely people are to believe it, right? Because it's so unbelievably audacious. And they've known about
Right.
this for a long time in the Hegelian dialect, the problem, reaction, solution. So yeah, it's just funny to watch all this backpedaling, but this is great. Here we have the Mythbusters, which of course one of the agents of the Illuminati trying to, bust stuff. And you can tell that even look at that glove. You can tell it's not pressurized. And even with it not pressurized, he was unable to hardly turn those bolts. But you pressurize that to the point where his blood doesn't boil in his fingers, and he won't even be able to move those fingers, not with 15 psi. Of pressure at any point along that spacesuit, and I would defy them to show us an example where that would be possible. I just don't think it is.
Yeah, you can see them bending their legs and stuff, and bending their fingers when that's supposed to be a highly, and there you can see his thumb, right?
His thumb, yeah.
Yeah. But they're supposed to be under this high pressure suit with a vacuum environment outside, and yet they're able to bend at the joints, and again, back then these were all sort of seamed together fabrics. I mean, it's just preposterous. It really is preposterous that people believe that they were doing this in a vacuum. You can see your hand now, we can see your thumb.
We can see
Yeah.
that.
I loved that. I tried to find that video that you did, Jared, and clip that in, but I couldn't find it.
Yep.
That's the hardest thing. Sometimes I can't remember either. I couldn't tell you what video that's in.
I know. I tried to find it for a while, and I was like, ugh, I can't find it.
It's
Yeah,
out
and
there
of course
somewhere.
the Glober rebuttal to that would be, well, no, that just looks like it. It's not really obviously not his thumb, because if it was, he'd die, right? But the thing that capped it was the announcer that the guy he was talking to in Houston saying, we can see your thumb. It's like, okay, explain that, genius.
Right, because that's really the only way that you're going to be able to do these tasks. Because I think that this is probably done underwater, and the only way that you're going to be able to do the tasks that they claim that they're doing is if you've got the use of your digits. I'm sorry, if you've ever tried to use even, like, let's just say a mitten and try to do, tedious work with your hands, it's hard. Now imagine if that mitten was like, highly pressurized so that you could barely move your fingers. Yeah, I mean, that's it just bleh,
Yeah.
makes me
And
sick.
look at this. It's so obvious that that's not pressurized. It's all wrinkled everywhere. There's not one iota of pressure in there. And he still can't turn those nuts, right?
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
Well, and
Anyway,
it's a backwards experiment anyway, because what they've done is they've essentially evacuated the chamber, and he's sticking his arm into the chamber, but it's nowhere near the amount of vacuum that would be in space or even on the moon, and there's obviously not all that pressure inside of the suit or the glove that he's in. So yeah, it's a half-assed experiment anyway. But even in that half-assed sort of extra light conditions, it's still difficult for him, right? So I mean, what does that go to show you?
yeah, exactly. So, and that's of course why we see, when we see the NASA videos, we see them just moving their clips around. They're little tether clips, and they're never doing anything ever.
Pause it there, because you can kind of see there's a line, like sort of, I don't know, about where the astronaut on the left's face mask is, where you can see that there's a foreground and then like a background painting, like a background set. And they never show you in any of these the fourth wall. They never do a 360 panorama unless there's specific shots that where they were tried to make it convincing. But in most of these spacewalk shots, you can clearly see like the old Stanley Kubrick technique of I guess it's sort of like a backlit back painting or whatever for the background, and then you've got
Right.
your foreground. It looks like a set to me with the lighting and everything. I mean, you can clearly see that they've got very, very nearby lighting, and of course they're not boiling in the sun and exploding.
Yep.
And I think it's great that you brought up the fact that they many times are doing some sort of extraneous activity. And when you said that, I was actually driving when I heard you say that, but I came home and looked at some old videos and just watched, and you're absolutely right. There's no change in the inflection of their voice that would come with the kind of activity that they're doing. When you're putting a lot of effort into something, or you're falling down, it sounds like it's all recorded after the fact.
Yeah, yeah, like bunny hopping along the surface of the moon,
Right.
in a situation where you could probably die any second, just even if a small little hole, pops into your suit, and the guy's just like, "Hey, this is great. I can hop around like this all day." He's not, he's obviously not performing some sort of cardiovascular activity.
Right.
Right. Even if you
Record yourself jumping up and down and see if you can keep your voice at one modulation. There's no way.
try
Right.
and do it in a swimming pool, you can't even do it in a swimming pool when you're, the mass of your body is greatly relieved.
Mhm.
It's just not possible to not have any voice change, and that was a good point, But people, when you want to believe in it, and again, they'll say the same thing about us. They will subconsciously look past stuff like that and never question it, because the mind and the cognitive dissonance simply won't acknowledge stuff like that. And then, of course, if it's brought out directly, then the excuses start being made up, which is very interesting. But there's a big difference between an excuse for something and an explanation of the action that makes sense. And I think a lot of the things that flat earthers do is, especially, my goal especially, is to try and explain things and not just have this, nebulous explanation, but an explanation that has some sort of basis in demonstrable science that we can actually go back and point to and say, see, like, for example, if we were to do this test and jump around in a swimming pool and try to talk without making it sound like we're doing anything strenuous at all, that would be something that you could point to, at least as some sort of viable evidence, to prove your point. But a lot of the times,
Even if you did
go ahead.
that, they're going to come back with some excuse for why that didn't happen, and that's the way it always is, and that's the way it will be. And I thank God for things like evolution and the moon landings to at least show me science isn't what they say they are. It's hilarious to me that people who talk about evidence and proof and all these things believe in the moon landings and believe in evolution and call it the most scientifically perfect theory there ever was. It's such a joke, because anything that you ever came up with to discredit it would just be explained away with just some nonsense reasonings.
Yeah. There's an answer for everything, and there again, you can sort of see the backdrop set. Yeah, they have an answer for everything, and it's like no matter what you show them. I guess my point is, if we can prove that NASA faked one single thing, then we really need to go back and revisit everything that they've purported and see if it seems to be true. And the more and more we do this, it really, really appears that they're faking everything, not just one or two things. They're faking it all. And it really begs the question, if they're faking all of this, then why? And globe earthers don't have an answer for that, you know?
Yeah, you got to wonder. I mean, you got to wonder if NASA just wishes that all the Apollo moon landings and stuff would just kind of go away because they are the easiest thing on Earth to debunk. I mean, it's so ridiculous, especially with the professional forensic analysis that have been done. All the things that we know now, that stupid, ridiculous cardboard and tinfoil paper, all these things. I mean, NASA, they just got to be hating it. And not to mention the fact that now, they sit there and tell us, oh, well, yeah, as soon as we can figure out, how to shield these astronauts, from these Van Allen radiation belts, we'll be able to go out and, go out into deep space and do things like this. And so, again, why is it a problem now when we did it, 5 or 6 times back in the 60s?
Take a look at the ISS guys when they go out for a spacewalk now. You have the 2 guys in the suits that need to be catered to by 2 other people as if they're their personal servants to put on every piece of the suit, connecting every piece. And then when they come back from space, they have to have somebody take it off for them. So how did Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take care of all those things by themselves? There was only the 2 of them. They're in the LEM. You've got to put on your own spacesuit. You've got one person that you've got the other person there to help you, but who puts on that final piece? Who connects the final glove? It's just preposterous that all that stuff is so difficult now, but back then they just did it with ease, and nobody has any of that on film, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was all lost and then found and then re-recorded over because they wanted to save money on reel-to-reels.
The greatest event ever in the history of humans, and we're going to just use this recorder over it.
Scientist Albert Einstein said, "I've come to believe that the motion of the Earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment, even though the Earth is revolving around the Sun." Now, don't you find this strange? That we are moving at phenomenal speeds, spinning and moving around the Sun, yet we see no visible proof of this. So Albert Einstein's statement can also be understood as, we see no evidence because the Earth is stationary. If we read what he says, or we pay attention to what he says, it can be understood in two different ways. Do some research into what Albert Einstein had to say about his connection with the Jesuits. Here he is with Georges Lemaitre, and the father of the Big Bang. So is it possible that we are simply being played? Is it possible that we're being deceived? Could it be that Albert Einstein was just simply a Vatican Jesuit puppet? Do some research into the largest telescope in the world, or one of the largest, Lucifer. It's owned 50-50 by NASA and by the Jesuits. The top astronomers in the world, all Jesuits. So why? What is the connection between the Vatican and Jesuits and astronomy? Because this is where we receive all our information from regarding space, is from them. Do some research into the Jesuits' control over the education system of universities. So, right from our early days in school, we are taught that the Earth is spinning, but there is no visible evidence of it. And we simply accept this. This is an amazing statement. An amazing statement like this would need amazing proof. But yet there is no proof. They're telling you that don't bother going and looking outside because you won't see anything, you won't find any proof. Because the most intelligent people in the world couldn't find any. Yet this little boy, you see, if he takes his hose pipe, the garden hose, and he turns from east to north, you will notice that the water will lag behind, the water droplets will show this motion. And if he spins that water nozzle around, the water drops will reflect the motion that this little boy puts on the nozzle. And if he turns, it will be reflected. And if he runs, he'll run into the water, and the forces and the friction will have an effect on the water droplets. Now we know this, and we've all done this as young children. Yet, when this little boy stands still in one direction, if he's facing east, the Earth is actually moving at over 100,000 kilometers easterly and spinning around the center axis at 1,600 kilometers. Yet the water droplets will show no evidence of this whatsoever. The water droplets will ignore this amazing speed and only reflect the motion that this little boy puts on the nozzle. The water droplets will reflect the motion this little boy puts on that hosepipe and totally ignore these amazing speeds that the Earth is spinning around the heavens as we're taught in school. This little boy can face north or south, and the water will not reflect his motion easterly. So they'll tell you, no, this is not a real experiment. You see, we mustn't do things like this, and we mustn't observe the earth around us. because we're not qualified. See, because Albert Einstein says that no matter how hard you look, you won't find anything. It's there, but you won't find it. See, does this sound logical to you? You see, what you need is 3 stooges, a wizard, some money, 3 calculators in a row, because the numbers being discussed will be so big that it won't fit onto one calculator. You'll need some windy contraption and a scale that is so finely tuned that it can weigh smoke. And on the opposite side of that scale will be a mirror that's so highly polished that if you looked into that mirror, you'd actually see the other end of the universe behind you. You see, experiments have to be complicated with big contraptions, and only wizards can do the experiment. And folks like you and I, we're not intelligent enough. Our eyes are not good enough. Remember, Albert Einstein says that there's no experiment that we can do. So ignore your eyes, ignore your mind. Go with what they tell you. You know, this attitude is reflected in the world around us. For example, you see, they tell you justice is blind because she's prejudiced. To avoid prejudice, she's blindfolded. When reality is, the scale is just a prop. You see, how can justice render a true account if she's blindfolded? She has to look at the scales. So justice doesn't need to see the scales. She's blindfolded because she's receiving instructions from the scale at her feet. You see, justice in the system isn't real justice. It's simply a serpent's standards, man's standards of what is right and wrong. It's not real justice. They don't need the scale, so they're blindfolded, because the information is coming from the scales at her feet. And we're in the same position. You know, if I ignore my eyes and I don't look at the scales, the real scales, and I'm listening to the other scales, well, then I'm going to be misled. It's an old story. We know the story well. We simply don't pay attention. So, Michelson and Morley experiment, they were just the 2 stooges, and along came Albert Einstein, and he sealed the deal, and we've been played. Remember Albert Einstein's statement that he said that the human eye is simply not good enough to make these judgments. Yet with the Michelson and Morley experiment, you walk around and around you go, and they split some beams through some smoke and mirrors into a device, and straight into the same human eye that Albert Einstein said is not good enough. So the purpose of the Michelson-Morley experiment was just to reinforce in your mind that the senses the Creator gave you is simply not good enough. That our eyes are not good, our senses are no good, and that we cannot do simple observations because our observations will be wrong. You won't be able to judge if you're on a small boat fishing and a fish eagle was fishing next to you. You wouldn't be able to determine if the fish eagle was moving or you were moving. This is being reinforced into our minds all the time, that we must ignore our eyes. Don't look properly, don't think. that these wizards have got everything nicely packaged for us. We have to go to them and listen to them, and they will tell us, their scales will tell us, not the real scales, not true justice and righteousness. Their scales will tell us. So I take my video camera, I go out, I watch the clouds moving. Now I know the clouds are moving, and I see the sun moving. I know the earth standing still. The clouds are moving and the sun is moving, and I can see the sun moving away and getting smaller as it moves away from me and disappears over the horizon. There's nothing difficult to understand in this. The problem is we've been believing these people and trusting in them, and we should not put our trust in men. That's the problem. So they'll tell you, no, you won't pick it up. You see, if I have a rotating platform, and here's a man on this platform, and he's filming the sun, and the sun is fixed at the center of that platform, he will see this motion in the camera. The rotation, you will pick it up, especially at sunrise and at sunset, because your angle is continually changing. They'll tell you the clouds are spinning with the earth. You will see the rotation in the clouds. So sure, the clouds will move as the wind blows them, but this motion, the rotation motion, would be unavoidable. You would see that rotation in the clouds, yet we don't see this at all. We don't look for this because Albert Einstein said to us, well, we won't see it, so we don't bother looking. You see, so we've stopped using our senses, we've stopped looking properly, we've stopped observing, and we've stopped thinking. We've become puppets. There's no appreciation for the real creation anymore. We've stopped appreciating the Creator and the Creator's wisdom. If you were traveling in a linear line and you were spinning and you were traveling at 70,000 kilometers an hour and your camera was fixed on a fixed position, whatever's in the distance would be blurry because you're traveling at these phenomenal speeds. Yet in our video footage, the sun and the clouds are both in focus. And if you're doing time-lapse, well, the further you are away from the center of the rotation, your time-lapse footage will be different. The sun in your time-lapse images will be traveling at different speeds. At the equator, it will be moving faster, and near the poles, it will be moving slower. Yet footage, time-lapse footage from all over the world, the sun moves at the same speed. Now, this is an issue. We're going to discuss this issue, the motion of the sun. If we just think about it, it's astounding. Look, your frame of reference, right? If you were on a rotating platform, your frame of reference would slide over. Your frame of reference, the speed would change, and the frame of reference would move behind you. So think about this. We're going to discuss this in more detail later on. In other words, your frame of reference, look at the red arrows, it slides over. Whereas what happens is we don't see this motion at all. Now, another issue connected with this is linear time. See, time travels at the same speed. It's linear. It can be measured. We measure it in seconds, in minutes. Its speed is constant. Now, if this speed and if time was related to the sun, well, now we have an issue. You see, now we have a big issue. Because let's take this young man. If he's on a Segway, right, and he's filming an object in front of him, and he's going around in a racetrack, In his video footage, when he plays that video footage back, the speed of whatever he's filming cannot be constant. So let's have a look at this. The same applies to the sun. Your speed, the speed of the sun, and your time will change, because your motion now is towards the sun, right? And now your motion is across the face of the sun. It would speed up. You'd catch up at 12 o'clock, and now your speed would still be faster. And now as you move away from the sun, your speed would slow down. So time itself, if you were living on a spinning ball, would be an issue. This simple fact that time is constant and the sun's motion across the heavens is constant is astounding. We just don't see it. We don't think about it. Think about it. The Creator created the motion of the sun at a constant speed no matter where you stand on earth. If you meditate on that and you understand that, its implication, it is truly astounding. It's mind-blowing. How the Creator did this, I've pondered this for years, and I don't know the answer, but it's astounding. So if you were on a moving platform, right, and you were filming a fixed object, and you had arrows above your head, you'd see those arrows in your footage, and those arrows would speed up and slow down. The arrows would move towards the object, and as you moved away, the arrows would move away from the object. You would see this. Despite what Albert Einstein said, you would see this in your video footage, and we don't see this. So regarding the frame of reference, so look at the arrows under the man. You see your position is moving towards the sun, right? And as you approach the sun now, your position now slides to the left. So if you were 2,000 kilometers away from the North Pole, or 6,000 kilometers, you would move forward 6,000 but slide to your left 12,000 kilometers at the same time, because you are off center and the light source is fixed to the center of the platform. Your frame of reference then would slide to the left and then slide behind you. But people filming the sun in a time lapse, and they're following the sun, simply rotate around their center position. It's not the same thing. There's a difference. But we don't think about these things, and we ignore this. Why? It's because we've been told that our senses and our minds and our eyes are simply not good enough. You see, we've been set up. We've been lied to. It's as simple as that. They send these men and tell us these men are geniuses, these people are so intelligent that we have to bow down to them, because if we don't, we're stupid. And it's a mistake. Do not put your trust in men, because if you do, they're going to make a fool of you, and they're going to make you their slaves. Simple as that. Do you want to be a slave? I don't. Not of a man. So take your garden hose, go into the garden.